Hi, my name is Katherine Kelaidis, and I'm the resident scholar at the National Hellenic Museum. And you're about to see my conversation with Anthony Roberts, a poet, educator, and veteran living in New Jersey. Anthony has a master's degree in fine arts from the New School in New York City, and his poetry has been published in a host of places that read like a who's who of places to have your poetry published in modern America. His first book, Pigtown, was published in 2017 by Red Dashboard Press and was nominated for a Pushcart Prize. It was also selected by Old Dominion University for inclusion in its writing program. His latest book, The Clearing Barrel, will be published by Blue Jade Press in the spring of 2021, and we have information about how to pre-order down in the dialogue box. I am so honored that Anthony took time to come talk to us today about his connection to the Hellenic legacy. Enjoy. So, hi, Anthony. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Wonderful. As I read your bio, I know people are thinking, why is he here? So can you tell us why you're here? What is your connection to the National Hellenic Museum's mission to tell the stories of Greeks and Greek Americans?
My very existence is because of a Greek American. Originally, Ivanos Paulos Fetfagidis, who later came to the United States by the name of John Fetfagidis, because, well, you know, as Americans are, we don't do very well with names, let alone Greek ones. Known as a child to me as Pop John. And he came here early 20th century, circa 1912, 1914. He was on the island of Chios, that's where he was born and raised, and spent some time as a youth, same age my daughters are now, between 13 and 16, fighting against the Turks to the point that he needed to leave. So he made his way to Thessaloniki, and then from there became a merchant seaman, traveled throughout the Aegean, then made his way into the Mediterranean, and then across the Atlantic to Brooklyn, New York originally, which is where he was during World War I. And to the best of our knowledge from what we've been able to gather and recollect from writings and letters that were sent that we have, spent a lot of time running the Liberty ships back and forth. Well, they weren't called that then, but the convoys that supplied the British during World War I, and then supplied American forces there after American entry. After that, he jumped ship in Baltimore. Apparently, there was some sort of a disagreement with the ship's captain that he wasn't amenable to, and came ashore and never left. His seafaring days ended. He met my great-grandmother under strange circumstances. She had actually left her husband, who was, from what we can tell, abusive. And early 20th century, women just did not leave their husbands. So she left him. The chronology of whether or not my great-grandfather was in the picture or not is kind of hasty, rather deliberately. And he met her, they settled down. Really, really different life from most Greeks. He opened a restaurant. And
radical.
And from there, that was really their life. A series of restaurants. Also, got involved, again, complete departure from what Greek Americans do. He bought houses, got into real estate.
Carving his own track there.
Oh, definitely. Forged his own path. And by the time I came into the world, early 70s, betraying my age, but he was elderly, but my grandparents worked, my parents worked. So he and my great-grandmother were really the only ones available for childcare. And so that's where I spent my formative years.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So I grew up in his house. And I touch on some of that in the poetry,
Yeah.
especially in Great Grandfather. I talk about the backyard, the grape leaves, the fact that, my first words were actually English profanity because that's what he excelled in. His command of English when he wanted it to be good was, but normally he would, make very heavy use of pejoratives and profanity. So yeah, my first words were "son of a bitch."
That seems fitting.
Yeah. I mean, it set the tone for me and the rest of my life. As you ask the people I work with. Yeah, he died when I was still pretty young, but his passing, his funeral, and the things that followed after, because he and my great grandmother, even though they fought constantly, died within months of each other.
I mean, that's pretty standard too, right?
Yeah. And I just remember going through the house. I was given his collection of National Geographic magazines, which had a huge impact on me, played a huge role in who I am today. They also had a habit of hiding money. They were survivors of the Depression. They didn't trust banks. He was very frugal, as was she. So when the house was cleaned out, there was money hidden everywhere, even in the shower curtain rods. Rolls of like 10s, 20s, dollar bills just shoved in. He would have been one hell of a drug trafficker.
This is all sounds very familiar.
Yeah. So anyway, so then growing up, that was my connection really to my Greek heritage. And my father, he was the first grandson, so held primacy of place in my great grandparents' hearts, and so he also shared Greek culture with me. My family is primarily Greek Irish. There's German and English in there as well, but the two driving cultures of my childhood were my Greek background and my Irish background. And in Baltimore, there's a huge Greek presence. East Baltimore was called Greek Town for the longest time. And so growing up, the Greek festivals, my father's horrid attempts at baklava. That's not true. I just make it better. But anyway.
I mean, you probably do.
Well, but so I always maintain that connection to my heritage. I was raised Roman Catholic, but again, my great grandfather's background, I got into a lot of trouble in Catholic school because I always crossed myself wrong, doing it the Orthodox way. And I still do that from time to time.
That's such a common story. Yeah, I think this is it's a very common. Especially, I mean, Chicago is similar that way, right? You have these kind of Greeks and Irish and things rubbing up against each other.
Exactly. And then, so then moving on, growing up, grew up.
Actually, before you move on, we're going to have you go ahead and read that poem you just referenced.
Great-grandfather?
Yeah, your great-grandfather. So that's going to happen now. And if you're watching, you're going to see that now.
Great-grandfather. The Greek sailor, whose wanderlust and blood are my inheritance, found his way to a place where he was landlocked, love-locked, stereotyped. He owned restaurants, he gave his grandsons houses. By the time his great-grandson arrived, he had little left to give me, save for memories. They have lasted longer than the houses. It was his gift that became my sentence. It was his gift that unlocked my prison. Greek myths are replete with stories like these, where the gods reward, then punish, then reward, if man can endure the punishment. Sitting in a high chair in his kitchen, then a booster seat, watching grape leaves from the yard rolled, turned into dolmas that I chewed happily. He used Concord grape leaves, and cursed a place too cold to grow olives. Cursed many things. So much so that my first words were profanities. I learned from him. I was too young to join him at the stove or the oven, content and confined, a spectator to creation, but I watched. Later, my grandmother would observe that my hands moved like his when cooking. The turn of the wrist with the spatula, the whole arm shaking spices. My hands moved like his when cooking. They still do. The punishment came with the house given to the grandson, a neighborhood with boundaries determined by salary and status. You could go beyond the borders, but you must always return. That was the rule. Unspoken, understood, unbroken. Generations of families separated by maybe a couple of houses or a street, sometimes separated by only a floor. The punishment was the gift, a home with borders. The challenge was to endure, evolve, escape, a test. The same test he had passed as a boy, making the journey between Kios and Thessaloniki, until he gained the strength to move across the ocean. The grandsons had failed the test. They all returned, receiving a home as a consolation prize. It was time to test me. Then he died. He left behind a key, stacks of magazines that took up an entire closet. They were willed to me, National Geographic, a child of 7, with the world piled in front of him. So in 1980, I went through the piles and found the April 1976 issue with a map of the Soviet Union and its peoples. Words foreign, but familiar. Places that he had spoken of presented themselves to me. Moscow, Leningrad, Kharkov, Vilnius, Odessa. His ghost talked about the port of Odessa with fondness. Volgograd, Tbilisi, Klaipeda, Polanka, Slav, Tatar, Cossack, Uzbek, Tajik, Ukrainian, Chechen, Georgian, Armenian. In many issues, more maps, each with its own path that led out of the room, out of the house, out of the neighborhood, out of the city, toward the sea. Now in a kitchen the size of the first floor of that house, I eat dolmas. My hands mimic his at the stove. I see the land outside that's mine, soil, fertile enough to grow grapes. I'll have my own leaves, and I'll curse a climate too cold for olives, and give my children maps.
I think I wanted to have you stop there because you're an incredible storyteller, so we could just have you sit here and talk. But I wanted to stop and give people a taste of the way those stories really come through this book, right? And there's so many references to your Greek heritage there in the book. So continuing on with your, you were telling us about growing up in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm. You grew up in Baltimore, and Baltimore of the not so much the 7, but the 80s was when the city started to go bad, and we were living in the middle of it. And we were touched by that, by the violence, by the poverty. In my first book, Pigtown, I really go into that and into the description of the neighborhood where I lived. I touched on that in my first book, and this second book is full length as opposed to the hybrid chapbook that was Pigtown. And I really get into an exploration of the personal rather than the environmental, rather than what I saw going on around me. This book really speaks to the experiential and what was going on in my life and within me at the time. So I was very lucky to go to one of the best high schools in Baltimore City, one of the best public schools, Baltimore City College, which has produced some of Maryland's most famous people, mayors, governors.
So going to Baltimore City High School?
Yeah, Baltimore City College High School. It's the 3rd oldest public high school in America.
Oh.
And in order to graduate from City, you were required to take Latin and philosophy courses.
Oh.
So that inspired my love of the classics. I mean, as a kid growing up in inner city Baltimore, you learned about Greek myths in elementary school, but Socrates was as foreign to me as the Supreme Court. Neither had a major impact on my life. So being immersed in the classics, in philosophy and history in high school, and then in a family where our most prized possessions were books. That's one thing I remember. My parents were both voracious readers. In particular, my mother who exposed me to poetry at a very early age. She had this fascination with Rob McEwen that I still don't understand, um, but then
Mothers.
exactly, you know. But then that led to the Odyssey and reconnecting with my heritage that way through its first written words.
Well, one of the things that struck me when I was reading your excellent book, that everyone should pre-order down below in the comments. Well, not in the comments, in the bio. Don't pre-order it in the comments. We have no way of getting it to you. But one thing that struck me was these sort of threads that you played with of those shreds of heritage and family and history. And I'm going to have you read Before the War here.
Mhm.
And then I have a few questions for you about it, if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
Before the war. I was a soldier who had become a sailor, adrift on becalmed waters, no shore visible in any direction, a rusted in place rudder, my compass pawned long ago at some port or other, numb to a present no different from the past, a future as unconcerned with me as I was with it. The boat leaked, but its cracks were sealed by scotch and sarcasm and the refusal to admit to each shoal or sandbar where I had run aground that I was never a good sailor. At some point, I switched the naval ensign, flew the Jolly Roger, but before long, I flew no flag at all, unsure of where to place my loyalty other than to the current that decided where I would go. And one wine-weary morning made bleary by dawn and sunlight the feeling of something off, something not right. From the deck, I watched 4 hawks fly overhead in the direction of my future. They collided with it, setting the world around me on fire, burning off the rust, rekindling old embers in my heart. Setting a course was easy, pointing the bow in the direction of smoke and conflagration, that I could see on the horizon a cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. Following backward the path of the hawks, a back azimuth into history, Alexander proved to be the greatest navigator, thanks to Arrian and a worn copy of the Odyssey translated by Lawrence. They provided comfort on those nights where the creak of wood sounded like the screeching of hawks. I landed on a strange shore, setting out to scale mountains to find the crags, cliffs, and crevices where hawks were known to dwell. I found my way to a nest. I smashed the eggs and killed all the hawks I could find, lest they too fly into the mountains that my children had built of their futures. Now others gather around me and I teach them how to hunt the hawks, how to destroy, how to bring fire, how to burn nests into ash. The first lesson: when your ship touches land, burn it. Then you have no choice but to hunt.
Thank you so much. We are trying some video editing, dear people of the internet, so hopefully this will work. So I loved reading Before the War, and one of the things I loved about it was the way that it connected sort of the experience I now know of your great-grandfather that you described, the experience of your grandfather that's described earlier in the book at war, and then pulls that back to Alexander and Odysseus. How would you? I guess what I was thinking as I was reading that is there is this, whatever else you want to say about war, it has been this constant experience that binds generations of men together. And certainly in the Greek experience, that is something that goes back millennia, right? That experience of warfare, and certainly, under the Turkish occupation and then the German occupation, back and back. So I was wondering if I could, I was wondering your thoughts on that and sort of how that colors your own experience of war, and your own experience as a soldier, and then as a poet, I guess, too.
All right. Well, first I'll say that what you said binds men together, and that's changed. I'd like to point that out, that it binds men and women together. The illustrations of this book are done by a woman, Rebecca Roberts, no relation. It's just the Welsh with that name managed to populate everywhere. But she is a female infantry officer who recently returned from a deployment to the Horn of Africa and Somalia and is a combat veteran in her own right now. She did the illustrations for the book, and
oh, wow.
I gave her free rein. I said, I want your experience on the page as well. And so I would just say that it does bind people together now across millennium. And
good job making me look hopelessly old-fashioned there. Good job.
You really need to you really need to work on your feminism. I
do.
You're so conventional. Anyway.
So conventional.
But yeah, the tie is there, and that was present in my mind when I was in Afghanistan. Going into city like Kandahar, which is the local the local variation of the name Alexander, and realizing that I was walking in those footsteps. There is that connection. Poetry itself, when I returned from my deployment, it played a key role in helping me find my way back. I'm pretty upfront about both, my own struggles. We've talked, offline about, sobriety and the fact that, when I came back from Afghanistan, my self-medication of choice was good scotch, not Ouzo. Never liked Ouzo.
Same.
But it was alcohol that numbed things, but it was poetry that helped. And in writing and in getting sober, that next connection emerges, which is that up until the 20th century, it was not uncommon for soldiers, military men, to also be, artistic, to be writers. Von Moltke, who's one of the most well-known Prussian officers and German officers of the time, von Moltke the Elder, was also a published poet. Alexander himself was known for, his love of the arts and his, desire to spread Hellenic culture. And while exactly. So while I won't put myself in that category, I will say that there was a certain kinship, and is a certain kinship, that I feel to those people who wore uniforms but were as, capable with a pen as they were with a sword or a rifle. Lord Byron, Joyce Kilmer, T.E. Hume, who I write about in this book. So that connection is crucial. The need to tell our stories is crucial. And poetry is a very effective medium for that. We can write nonfiction all day. The SEALs have a cottage industry of doing it. And, but the ability sometimes to convey emotion and the intensity of that emotion, poetry is the best tool for it.
Well, as you're talking, I was just thinking about there's a line, and I can't think of the exact citation now, but there's a line in Aeschylus about wine and poetry being the only things that numb the memory of war.
Yeah, I live.
You're like aware of that. That's I think a really and how resonant that is, and I think it's one of the reasons. So one of the reasons, full disclosure, Tony and I are friends as well. But one of the reasons I wanted to have you on was because I've been thinking a lot. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that, my generation, and you're slightly older than me, they're not much older, our generation, really were the ones who fought the war on terror, right? Fought the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And there's actually been very little, artistic production that's come out of that. From for such a small portion of our generation actually went and fought, right, because of the nature of a volunteer army and things. But when you think about the absolute, plethora of material that comes out, for example, the First World War, right? I mean, just you have an entire sort of artistic flowering that comes out of that. How very little, and you've mentioned there are these memoirs that have been quite popular, and maybe that's about the confessional nature of our age, but there's been very little artistic output. And so I'm really interested in sort of elevating voices of Gen X and millennial veterans who are creating art. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Like, why is that? I don't know the answer to that question. But I'm assuming you do either. But I think it's really interesting. There's none of that.
Part of it, I think, is due to the nature of the digital age. My own children are a prime example of this. Getting my sons to read books. We've finally cracked the code on that. They actually like to read to themselves at night now, which is great, but it was a fight. And the screen has in some ways replaced the book with the, what stimulates the mind. There are groups and individuals working toward a better expansion of knowledge in terms of poetry in particular. The Dead Reckoning Collective, a fellow poet, Ben Fortier, who is a former Marine, phenomenal poet, some beautiful work. The other thing is, and you touched on the nature of the all-volunteer force, and that also plays a part in it, where a lot of what we've written is for us. If you go into the book, there's the poem People Always Want to Know About Afghanistan. And that really gets into the heart of the experience, is one that even when we do explain, sometimes people still don't understand, because the memories, the experiences are so personal, and they're things that only people who were there or who were in similar circumstances, somebody writing about Iraq, there are going to be things there that I don't get. I write about things about Afghanistan, somebody who was in Iraq may not get. But there's that shared experience, though, of being someplace different, foreign, that the vast majority of the population sometimes struggles to connect to. Less than 1% of the population serves in uniform. And it plays a role and it narrows your audience, but sometimes you write just because you have to, and you're writing for a very small audience, but it's an audience that wants to hear what you have to say.
This wasn't on my original list of poems I was going to have you read, but would you mind reading People Always Want to Know What Happens in Afghanistan for us?
I'd be happy to.
Yeah. So we're gonna listen to that now.
People always want to know about Afghanistan. I'm the actor in the movie everyone remembers. No matter what else he's done, typecast into a role. It was 1 year of my life, 1 year out of more than 40. All the other things I've been escape your notice. What do you want to know? What should I tell you? Why should I tell you? Of boredom punctuated by the occasional rocket, fear in the valley on the Bagram Road, the constant searching for the evil white Corolla, ubiquitous, the Flying Dutchman, the white whale of Afghanistan. The smells, sounds, sights, tastes, you wouldn't understand or care. They can't be recreated or described, no matter how good of an Afghan restaurant you've found. Of import to you, the future, can it survive, thrive, your pet issue here? Are we winning? Of import to me, the past, the now. How are the Askari I trained and lived with? Are my Terps safe? You speak as an expert on Sunday shows. You lecture me on the latest article, interview, white paper, news story. Yet you don't even know that they're Afghans, not Afghani. You ask me if I speak the language. I ask which one. I greet you in Dari. You think I'm fluent. You want war stories? I have none to give you. I have humor and mirth. I'll tell you anyway. You started this conversation. And I'll give you what you asked for, much to your chagrin. The stories of stolen olive oil, of coke straw and snaggletooth, of the one who cracked the code, of Tre Leche, of maddening pubic hair on urinals, of working for the Department of Agriculture, of chicken, of cigars and profanity, pipe tobacco with Canadians, Albanian auto maintenance, frozen fuel lines, chess with a savant. You look bored. I apologize. Clearly, I'm not who you thought I'd be. You might be surprised to know I'm not who I thought I'd be either. I'm not a hero. I'm a Shonkai. But the tales I tell are understood only by those who were there. Would you like to hear the other 39 years, my daughters, my sons, my wife, of their pain and sacrifice due to my absence? Apparently not. Nice chatting. People always want to know about Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. That wasn't on my original list of poems I was going to have you read, but I think because of the nature how the conversation developed, it was worth having you read. And I will add, there's so many beautiful pieces in this collection, like absolutely beautiful pieces. I think, and more than we have time to go into today, obviously. I think you write really movingly about the death of your mother, and that sort of sense of loss. And just in general, I think you do this incredible job of writing about loss and writing about longing at the same time, right? And I think that is maybe something that, certainly I think after the pandemic and everything that's going on, we're going to have to get better at is writing about, is thinking about loss and communicating that and that sense of brokenness. And there's a poem, Love and Baklava, Lessons from a Greek Man, that is in the collection that I'm going to have you read now. It's a lot of poetry if you're not poetry people, but why are you listening to this if you're not poetry people? So I'm going to have him read that now, and then I want to come back and talk about that for a minute.
Love and Baklava, Lessons from a Greek Man. The debate can be made as to what is more fragile, sheets of philo or the human heart. The heart, thick muscle that drives the body for its entire life, charged with current, pulsing lifeblood through vessels it cannot see, knowing time only by blood's movement through ventricles in return. When broken, the heart does not heal, only grows scar tissue. It holds the muscle together. Tomorrow becomes the goal. Tomorrow, and perhaps they'll find a way to again make the heart whole. Labor without pleasure, each pulsing measure, working toward the inevitable Shema and Shalom. God and death waltzing to scarred metronome. The tides of a lifespan marked by the beach that erodes with each year until skin is stretched, taut, and thin. Like philo, is more easily repaired. Sheet laid flat if torn, gently pinched between the fingers of Yaya and pressed smooth. The fissure no longer present. Butter brushed over to seal. Vulnerable, thin membrane strengthened by layer on layer. Sheet, butter, brush, sheet, butter, brush, sheet, butter, brush, repeat. Until the dough becomes strong enough to withstand pressure of pecan, pistachio, and walnuts, heat of a 325-degree oven for an hour and 15 minutes. The searing sweetened syrup already prepared, rose water, honey, lemon, sugar, balm, or anointing oil, poured over still hot dough, now hardened by its infernal ordeal. You hear it sizzle as it seeps into the spaces between dough and filling, a protective barrier the heart lacks. Sugary scar tissue that encases all, leaving behind a smile. And the flutter of a scarred heart. when it's consumed by one who knows how much it hurt to make it.
And we're back. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate you doing these readings. We're trying something different, and hopefully it works. There's just some really, really beautiful parts of this poem that I loved, but I really loved this part. Philo is more easily repairable, sheet laid flat if torn, gently pinched between the fingers of Yaya and pressed smooth, the fissures no longer present, butter brushed over to seal the vulnerable thin membrane. And that image of, so much of the image of what comfort looks like and what healing looks like is those Greek women gathered at the table. And that was just so incredibly powerful. So I wonder if you had a few minutes to just kind of talk about that poem. And, it's located in a place in the book where it really does work. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
The origin of the poem and its writing is actually pretty boring.
Okay.
I was making baklava for work.
Like you do.
Yeah, like you do. And made a couple trays and was just, I don't know. I tend when I cook cooking is how I relax, but also I tend to get, cooking inspires memory. So many of my memories of my family, of childhood, of experience center around the kitchen. Big shock for the Greeks, right?
Once again, very unique Greek experience you're having there.
Why am I even here? I'm not really Greek.
Not Greek at all. This does not sound familiar. This is going to be alienating to our audience.
Sorry in advance, but so just thinking about that and the repetition that goes into laying the phyllo, brushing it with butter, and laying the phyllo and brushing it with butter, and remembering my grandmother yelling at me about, you never just lay phyllo. You don't put all of them down and then butter it. You butter one sheet at a time. And just about how, in a lot of ways, yeah, it's a metaphor for the heart and the idea of healing, and that healing can come from those everyday experiences that allow you to get past those more painful or traumatic experiences that become like the exclamation points in our life. It's the ellipses between those where we do things in the kitchen, where we, sit with a cup of coffee. And if you're lucky and have a yaya who can flip your coffee cup and read it. But
yeah,
it's those things that are really what help us move forward.
No, and I think one of the things you do a really excellent job of in this collection is juxtaposing and kind of holding that tension between the things that bind us together and the things that make us feel alien, right? And the extent to which so much of our lives are that sort of dual experience. And I think, like, in the context of the work we do at the museum, so much of the immigrant experience is about that, right? So much of the immigrant experience from my position is about, like, being part of the Greek diaspora experience, is being part of this very tight-knit community, being connected into this very tight-knit community, but at the same time, being not only different than the culture around you, but then being different than your community, right? So I never feel more American than when I'm in Greece. I never feel more Greek than when I'm in America. And, I think part of that, and this is going somewhere, part of that is about language. And so I would be interested to know, you mentioned studying Latin, and you're someone who makes your living with words. So I'd be interested to know, first about your sort of early, what your experiences with the Greek language are, and then I'm going to have you read Kios at the end. but you mentioned in there, and I don't know if it's autobiographical or just for the poem, it's a language you do not know.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could kind of if you have some thoughts on sort of language, and as we have these conversations about heritage language preservation and all of that.
Well, this will be, I guess, a departure from, what we would call the norm of the Greek experience. And that my great grandfather, he was determined that his daughter would be American. So she understood Greek, she spoke it, but she rarely used it, very rarely. And then
that's not unusual.
Okay.
I'll tell you that right now. That sounds very normal. Yeah.
And then after he passed, her need to use it, because she was an only child, became almost nil. At that point, she was married, fully immersed in, this Irish family of mad men and mad women, but still went to great lengths to preserve her own culture. I remember in their home, dolls that were dressed in traditional Greek clothing, icons that she kept in a corner of the dining room that were kind of like this, I don't know, maybe middle finger to Roman Catholicism.
Very Greek woman thing to do.
Yeah. But also, for me, language-wise, my great-grandfather was more interested in immersing me in the culture, and most of the Greek that he taught me, I'd forgotten over time. I remember some of the Russian, where he picked that up, I don't know. Maybe
that whole generation was like, they'd have like random. My great grandfather, we'd be like in the store, and he'd like suddenly like start speaking like Amharic to like some Ethiopian immigrant. I'd be like, where did you
find that? Yeah. Like oddly enough, in Afghanistan, I found Russian very useful.
Yeah, of course.
The unit that I advised, the company commander there, was a veteran of the Soviet-backed Afghan army. So if we wanted to talk and we didn't want his soldiers to understand, we'd go to Russian. So it was kind of unusual. And that was something I pursued in high school. Languages have always fascinated me, it's enabled me to connect with people in ways that you wouldn't expect. Spanish, obviously, German, which is a favorite language of mine.
Our shared language.
Yeah, exactly. Our shared language with our mutual friend who will not be named.
We actually, so for the audience at home, we know each other because Anthony served with a friend of mine from childhood, really. So that is our connection with one another initially. So sorry, yeah.
No worries. And so language it's crucial, and especially as Americans, we're so horrible at it. This belief that wherever we travel, as long as we speak English at appropriately loud enough volume, people are going to understand us.
That's the key.
Yeah. And what I've taught my own children is simply, if you want to understand a culture, even as an outsider, learn its language and learn its profanities, because then you're going to learn what's sacred to it.
No, it's true.
Which can give you a little insight as well. But yeah, language, the ability to communicate, the ability to write, and to express myself has always been important. That need for the vocabulary to find what it is that I want to say.
Well, I was noticing the very, very impressive list of languages your poetry has been translated into.
Yes.
Are the world's oldest continuous linguistic tradition is not included in that list. And I think we should probably do something to fix that.
If you or someone would be interested in translating some of my work into Greek, I would be honored.
We should talk more about that offline, because I certainly think the last poem I'm going to have you read I think would be really beautiful in Greek. So we're going to have you read Kios, which is, of course, as you told us earlier, the island that your grandfather came from, and of course a place that has a really fascinating history, certainly within the context of the Ottoman occupation,
Mhm.
and was ruled by Crete in ancient times. So really, I'm your boss. Um,
Can I have a day
but
off?
never. So we're gonna go ahead and have you read that, and we'll be right back.
Kios. I dream of the Aegean and the blue around Chios, lamb season dripping on pita, a block of feta, blue-black olive shine against the ivory of a tablecloth, and the bright white of the sun that doesn't burn. The ouzo untouched, a reminder of the damnation of Irish jeans. Pass by, until the taste of the olive drowns out the scent of anise. Sent away across the blue to the brown of a foreign harbor where a young man started on a path that a century later finds me here, trying to find the words to say that I want to go home in a language I don't know.
And we're back. Wonderful. Thank you so very much. I've been really honored that you joined us today. And I think this was an incredibly sort of insightful conversation. So before I let you go, because I know you have, it's actually 7:30 in the morning on the East Coast when we're recording this. Anthony's been very generous with his time. So before we go, I'd just like to first, do you have any projects coming up that we should know about? I know you have the book that's available for pre-order, and we will share the information. So the Clearing Barrel was available for pre-order on February 1st. We're going to have the information in the dialogue description box. I'm not really a YouTuber. In the description box about how you can order that. But where else can we find you?
You can find me on my website, www.varangywriting.com.
That'll also be in the dialogue.
That'll be in the dialogue as well. And it's
That'll
also an homage to the Greeks and the Byzantine Empire. The Varangians were the guards of the Byzantine emperor, who were originally Vikings who found their way into the Mediterranean, and later were joined by Celts and Saxons.
The Greeks are everywhere in this young man.
Truth. And so you can find me there. You can see myself and a list of great writers at Blue Jade Press, my publisher. And
I'll also put that in the description.
Okay. And then I'm also working now with the Irish American Writers and Artists, which is a group of not only Irish Americans, it's pretty much everybody, out of New York City, founded by Malachi McCourt, the writer and brother of Frank McCourt, the author of Angela's Ashes, and Larry Kerwin, who is the singer for the band Black 47. A great group of people. We're looking at one of their salons. Hopefully in March will be when we do the official release for the book. Pre-sale has begun, as you said, on February 1st. That ends on February 14th. That will get you a signed copy of the book sent to you, and it should arrive on or before the actual publication date. So you'll have it before everybody else. There are a lot of other projects moving forward. I'm sorry?
Go ahead. I was going to say, I just said excellent, but go ahead.
Going back to my heritage again, the concept for my third book will center around poems that are based on the muses of antiquity. And then
we will have to have you back.
I would like to do that. And then there's also a play in development, but if and when that'll be staged remains to be seen.
There are lots of places to check you out. I would encourage everyone to go ahead and do this. I think it is so important that we kind of celebrate and highlight diverse voices from the Greek American experience and Greek American writers. So I really appreciate you taking time to be with me today. Thank you so much. And for all of you out there, I will see you next time. Goodbye.